A father married his own daughter in an Appalachian valley. There were no disguises, no escape in the night, no secret ceremony hidden from the world. The church signed the papers, neighbors stood as witnesses, and the law found no urgent reason to stop it. This did not happen because the valley was ignorant. It happened because the land was valuable, the money was steady, and silence was easier than resistance. What you're about to hear is not a story about passion, madness, or impulse. It is about inheritance turning into control, tradition turning into permission, and a community deciding that survival mattered more than a child. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what you're about to hear didn't happen in a war zone or a cult or some forgotten country. It happened in an Appalachian valley where everyone knew the truth and chose silence. In the high folds of an Appalachian valley, where the roads narrowed into gravel and the mountains pressed in close like silent witnesses, the death of the mother did not arrive with chaos or public grief. It arrived quietly, almost conveniently, on a cold morning when the mist clung low to the trees and the house seemed to hold its breath. The woman had lived her entire life on that land, born into it, raised by it, and eventually buried by it. What few outsiders ever understood was that the land itself mattered more than the people standing on it. In that valley, land was not scenery. It was currency, protection, and power passed down through bloodlines that rarely left the mountains. The funeral was small, as expected. Neighbors stood in dark coats, boots still dusted with soil from their own fields. No one cried loudly, no one asked questions. The husband stood straight beside his daughter, his face calm, almost composed in a way that unsettled those who noticed. He did not look like a man who had lost something essential. He looked like a man calculating what came next. The daughter, barely 17, stood rigid and silent, eyes fixed on the ground, as if the earth itself might open and swallow her. Most people in attendance assumed her silence was grief. A few suspected it was fear. What the town knew, even if it never said it aloud, was that the woman's death created a problem, not emotional, but legal. The land did not belong to the husband. It never had. Decades earlier, the deeds had been written through the women of the family, an old arrangement meant to protect property from gambling, drinking, or outside men who might sell it off. The paperwork was old, handwritten and rarely discussed, but it was binding. With the mother gone, ownership passed directly to the daughter, a minor, a girl. And in that valley, a girl owning hundreds of acres without a husband was not seen as independence. It was seen as vulnerability. Within days of the burial, conversations began, not in public, but in kitchens, on porches, and in the back rooms of the church. Men spoke in low voices about responsibility and protection. Women spoke in coded language about tradition and survival. No one framed it as cruelty. It was framed as necessity. The land was valuable. Timber rights alone could bring in more money than most families saw in years. Mineral access beneath the soil promised even more. Losing that land to courts, outsiders, or distant relatives would be unthinkable. The valley had seen it happen before. Families pushed out, houses left empty, names forgotten. The father was a man shaped entirely by that fear. He had grown up watching neighbors lose everything after a death or a dispute. He understood the system better than most. He knew the law well enough to see its gaps, and the church well enough to know how easily scripture could be bent to fit need. To the town, he did not present himself as desperate or dangerous. He presented himself as practical, a widower trying to keep his family intact, a man doing what had to be done to prevent ruin. The daughter, meanwhile, was spoken about more than she was spoken to. People commented on her quiet nature, her obedience, her lack of protest. Some took her silence as consent. Others took it as proof that the arrangement would be easy. Very few considered that she had no language for what was happening, no power to refuse it, and no safe place to run. In a valley where everyone knew everyone, escape was not a concept that existed. The mountains did not open outward, they closed in. The church became the turning point, not through sermons or announcements, but through visits. The pastor came to the house under the pretense of comfort. He spoke about scripture, about widowers in the Old Testament, about how families had once survived without modern judgment. He never said the word marriage. He did not need to. The implications settled into the room like damp air. When he left, there was no relief, only understanding. By the end of that first winter after the mother's death, the valley had already accepted what was coming. No one protested because no one framed it as wrong. It was framed as protection, as stability, as a way to keep outsiders away and money flowing inward. The daughter's inheritance had transformed her overnight, from child to asset, from grieving girl to solution. And in that transformation, something essential disappeared, though no one in the valley seemed willing to name it. The weeks that followed were marked by an unsettling calm, the kind that settles over places where decisions have already been made and no one feels responsible for making them official. The house returned to routine quickly. Meals were cooked, wood was stacked. The father resumed his work as if nothing fundamental had shifted, and in a way, nothing had, at least not for him. The daughter moved through the days quietly, her presence acknowledged, but rarely addressed directly, as though speaking to her too openly might disturb the fragile logic everyone else was relying on. In the valley, silence was not avoidance. It was participation. The church became the center through which justification flowed, not through sermons meant for everyone, but through private conversations that carried more weight than anything spoken from the pulpit. Elders visited one by one, sitting at the kitchen table, their hands folded, their tone measured. They spoke of order, of protection, of how outsiders misunderstood mountain life and imposed rules that did not fit its realities. They reminded the father that Scripture had always bent to necessity when survival was at stake. They reminded the daughter that obedience was a form of faith. What they did not discuss was choice. Legal boundaries were treated with the same selective attention. State law, age restrictions, and obvious moral conflicts were brushed aside through loopholes and delays. The daughter was close enough to adulthood that paperwork could be timed. Guardianship could be adjusted, consent could be redefined. In a place where records were handwritten and offices understaffed, procedure mattered less than intent. And intent, everyone agreed, was preservation of land, of family name, of economic stability. When the date was set, it was done quietly. No announcement was made, no celebration planned. This was not a union meant to be admired, only accepted. A small group gathered inside the church on a weekday morning, chosen carefully. People who would not talk, or who would talk only in ways that softened what they had seen. The daughter wore a plain dress, not white, not new. The father wore the same dark suit he had worn to the funeral months earlier. The overlap did not go unnoticed, but no one acknowledged it. The ceremony itself was brief, stripped of emotion. Words were spoken carefully, avoiding anything that might sound romantic or intimate. The pastor framed the marriage as a covenant of responsibility, not affection. Vows were recited like obligations, not promises. When it ended, there was no applause, no lingering conversations. People left in pairs or alone, stepping back into daylight as though exiting a space they would later pretend they had never entered. What followed was not scandal in the way outsiders imagine it, but normalization. The town adjusted quickly. Neighbors stopped referring to the daughter as a child. They corrected themselves mid-sentence when they did. Meals were delivered as they always had been, now framed as support for a married couple rather than condolences for a grieving family. The language shifted just enough to make the arrangement seem permanent, inevitable. Any discomfort that remained was buried under routine. Inside the house, the power dynamic became unmistakable. Decisions were no longer explained. They were expected to be accepted. The daughter's days became smaller, her movements more controlled. She stopped attending gatherings alone. She stopped being asked about her future. Her role had been decided, and with it, her relevance as an individual quietly disappeared. What mattered now was stability, how the arrangement looked from the outside, how smoothly it functioned, how little attention it drew. The most disturbing element was not the father's authority, but the town's cooperation. Every official document required a signature. Every signature required a witness. Every witness was a choice. And each choice reinforced the same conclusion. This marriage did not exist in secret, and it did not survive because no one knew. It survived because enough people decided that keeping the system intact mattered more than confronting what it demanded. By the time the valley fully settled into this new reality, the act itself had already faded into background noise. What remained was its structure. A household legally sound, socially tolerated, and economically secure. The land stayed whole, the money stayed local, and the cost, though visible to anyone who looked closely enough, was treated as an unfortunate but acceptable price for preserving the order the valley depended on. The transformation did not announce itself with violence or spectacle. It arrived through paperwork, through ledgers and quiet visits from men who never stayed long and rarely explained why they had come. Contracts were signed at the same kitchen table where condolences had once been offered. Timber rights were leased first, then expanded. Trucks began to appear at the edge of the property, their engines cutting through the stillness of the valley before disappearing again with loads of freshly cut wood. Each departure left the land visibly thinner, but the house visibly richer. Money altered the atmosphere more efficiently than any public declaration ever could. Repairs that had been postponed for years were suddenly made without discussion. The roof was replaced. New tools appeared in the shed. Church donations increased in neat, predictable amounts, enough to be noticed, but not enough to raise questions. Employment followed. A few men from nearby families were hired seasonally, grateful for work that allowed them to stay in the valley. Gratitude, like silence, proved easy to cultivate. Public records shifted quietly. The daughter's name, once clearly tied to the land, began to fade from view. Tax filings were consolidated. Authority over transactions moved decisively into the father's hands. To anyone reviewing the documents without context, the arrangement looked ordinary. A married couple managing inherited property. What was missing was not evidence of wrongdoing, but evidence of her existence as a separate legal person. She became present only as a line item, a dependent folded into someone else's control. Inside the house, daily life narrowed further. The daughter's responsibilities increased, but her agency did not. She maintained the home, accounted for supplies, and followed routines that left little room for unpredictability. She was rarely seen alone. When she spoke, it was usually in response to a question, never as an interruption. Over time, even neighbors stopped addressing her directly, defaulting instead to the father for decisions large and small. It was easier that way. Order was preserved. The psychological erosion was subtle, almost invisible to those not looking for it. There were no public scenes, no cries for help, no dramatic moments that might have forced intervention. Instead, there was withdrawal, long silences, a growing absence of opinion. People mistook compliance for calm, mistook stillness for acceptance. In a culture that prized endurance, the ability to endure quietly was interpreted as strength. The financial structure continued to deepen. Mineral surveys were conducted. Rights were discussed that extended far beyond the father's lifetime. The land, once a family legacy, had become an asset optimized for extraction. And as the income stabilized, so did the town's commitment to looking away. The arrangement had begun to benefit more people than it harmed, at least on paper. That arithmetic mattered. Rumors surfaced occasionally, but they never traveled far. A comment made at a gas station, a question asked by a distant relative who did not stay long. Each was absorbed and neutralized by the same response. This was how things had always been done here. Outsiders did not understand. The law did not account for mountain life. Tradition was invoked as explanation and shield, even when the tradition in question was barely a generation old. As years passed, the daughter aged into adulthood, but nothing about her position changed. Legal maturity brought no freedom. By then, the system was complete. Financial ties, social reinforcement, and institutional approval had formed a closed loop. Leaving would mean losing everything: land, support, identity, and protection. Staying required only one thing: continued silence. What emerged was not a family in the traditional sense, but a functioning structure designed to convert inheritance into control. Love was irrelevant. Morality was negotiable. What mattered was that the land remained intact, the money continued to flow, and the valley stayed undisturbed. In that calculus, the daughter was no longer seen as a person to be protected, but as a role to be maintained quietly and indefinitely for the benefit of everyone who depended on the arrangement remaining exactly as it was. The unraveling did not come from outrage or confession. It came the way most long-buried arrangements end, through paperwork disturbed by someone with no emotional investment in keeping the past intact. Years later, when the land was assessed again for sale, subdivision, or inheritance, an outsider followed the trail of documents with fresh eyes. Deeds were cross-checked. Dates were compared. Names that should have appeared together did not. What had once looked ordinary under the assumptions of the valley began to look irregular under the neutrality of record review. Questions followed, not loudly, but persistently. Why had ownership transferred in the manner it did? Why had guardianship dissolved so cleanly? Why had church records aligned so neatly with legal filings during a narrow window of time? Each answer led to another document, another signature, another witness whose role now appeared less benign than it once had. What had been normalized through repetition began to look deliberate through distance. By the time attention returned to the valley, the father was no longer present in any meaningful way. Age, illness, or death had removed him from accountability, leaving behind a structure that could not defend itself without exposing its foundations. The daughter, now middle-aged, remained. She was not interviewed publicly. She was not asked to explain. Her silence was interpreted in multiple ways, by some as evidence of complicity, by others as proof of long-term coercion. What few considered was that silence had been the only condition under which she had ever been allowed to exist. The town responded predictably. Some denied remembering the details, others claimed ignorance, despite signatures that contradicted them. A few defended the arrangement outright, insisting it had been necessary, that it had prevented worse outcomes, that it had kept the land local and families fed. Responsibility dissolved into generality. No one had forced it. No one had decided it. It had simply happened, according to everyone who benefited from it. There was no dramatic reckoning, no trial that satisfied moral expectation. Any legal consequences were minimal, constrained by time, jurisdiction, and the careful construction of legitimacy years earlier. Institutions distanced themselves. Records were amended quietly. Statements were issued that acknowledged procedural errors without naming harm. The system corrected itself just enough to move forward without looking back. What remained was a landscape unchanged on the surface. The roads were the same. The church still stood. The valley continued its routines. But the story lingered, passed unevenly, resurfacing in fragments whenever the land changed hands, or an outsider asked the wrong question. It became one more example of how something deeply wrong can exist openly, survive legally, and end without resolution, not because it was hidden, but because it was tolerated. The most unsettling truth was not what happened between a father and a daughter, but what happened around them. A community watched an inheritance become a mechanism of control. Institutions provided language that softened the act. Records gave it permanence, and when it finally surfaced, it was treated not as a crime to confront, but as an embarrassment to be managed. In the end, the valley did what it had always done. It absorbed the story, adjusted its explanations, and returned to silence. The land remained, the system endured, and the cost, carried quietly for decades by one person, was left unrecorded, existing only in the space between what was legal, what was accepted, and what should never have been allowed to happen at all.